Welcome back to another episode of Annie Makes Art School. I'm really excited for today's session because we're going to get into figure drawing, which is so much fun. But as a reminder, like with most of the topics that we cover in these sessions, there's almost never a right or wrong way to do anything art related. This is just a perspective to try out and see if you like. For today, I'm going to focus in on 4 major areas of figure drawing, which are expression, form, weight, and line. I would also say that one of the other top important categories to focus on is anatomy, but that's kind of a whole other can of worms, so we're going to get into that in further sessions down the line, and for today we're just going to focus on those first 4 categories. I also will say, if you have the opportunity to do a figure drawing session in person with a live model, I highly recommend it. For today, I'm just here in my studio, so I'm going to be working from some photo references, and that's totally okay and often a lot more accessible for people. But I do think that the experience of working with a live model has a really different feel to it and can be a really important learning tool. So if the opportunity ever arises to do that, I definitely recommend taking it. All right, for today, we're going to want a few materials. Basically, it just boils down to something to draw on and something to draw with, and then possibly a few blending tools. In this case, I'm working on newsprint. I really like doing figure drawing in newsprint because it doesn't have that precious quality to it that a sketchbook or some higher quality paper might. It's intentionally kind of thin, flimsy paper, so as you're working, if a sketch isn't going the way you want, you can completely scrap it and move on to the next one, and it's not that big of a deal. That said, if you don't have newsprint on hand, any paper is just fine. You're also going to want something to draw with, which could just be something traditional like a pencil or pen. I love using brush pens a lot when I'm figure drawing, but for today's session, I'm going to be working with Vine charcoal and Conte crayon. Vine charcoal has this really light, airy quality to it that I really adore, and then Conte has a little bit more of a harder hand. It's going to get you some of those darker darks, so having both those available can be really nice while you're working. And then as far as blending tools, if you have a blending stub, that's great. If not, you can be cheap like me and just work with Q-tips. They still get the job done. Or honestly, half the time I just use my finger and that works too. You end up with pretty dirty hands, but the art looks nice. And then last, it's nice sometimes to have an eraser on hand. I honestly don't recommend doing a lot of erasing of the structural elements of your drawing. So if you have guidelines and things like that, I think it's nice to leave those behind in the image. However, there are times that your image might get a little bit muddled or the hand smudges can kind of make it harder to see, and being able to pull out some of those bright highlights with an eraser can really come in handy. If you have a kneaded eraser, that's what I would recommend, but I couldn't find mine today, so I'm just using a regular one, and that's okay too. Let's get started. If you're uncertain about where to start with your figure, these are a couple extremely helpful markers to begin with. An oval with a center line to show the placement of the head and face, horizontal lines to mark the angle and placement of shoulders and hips, and a vertical line expressing the positioning of the spine. These guides don't need to be placed with absolutely perfect accuracy. They're more of a framework to map out your composition and to be refined over the course of your sketch. As you'll see throughout this video, oftentimes these markers aren't used at all, but they are a great place to start if you're feeling overwhelmed by the blank page or uncertain about how to address a complex pose. Now let's get into our 4 major focuses. Generally, when I'm working on a figure drawing, I'm going to address each of these elements in different areas, but for an example, I'm going to draw the same figure 4 times, and for each one I'm going to focus on one specific section. In this case, I'm starting off with an expressive drawing. The key elements of an expressive drawing are that you're wanting to use fast, decisive mark making, and that you're less concerned with having a perfectly accurate rendering of the anatomy, and more looking to capture the sense of movement or fluidity in the pose. For this next pass of the figure, I'm going to focus on form rather than expression. To do that, I'm going to start by breaking the figure down into large chunks, kind of like if you were building a snowman. I'm just going to lightly sketch in ovals. Sometimes in less soft figures, there might be harder angles, like in this case I've used a sharp line to show where the jaw is. But generally speaking, most forms tend to be a little softer feeling, so it's going to be a lot of circles and ovals showing the general shape of the various structures of the body. Once I have those broad areas mapped out, I can start drawing them together and filling in the spaces in between. For this next pass of the figure, I'm going to focus on weight. Another way of looking at this is you're basically drafting the shadows of the figure. And a really great exercise for doing that is to have yourself mark only the dark areas of the image without using any line at all. This exercise should feel honestly closer to painting than it does drawing. You're mapping out large areas of dark and light, and it's a great way to experiment with your materials. In this case, I've turned my vine charcoal on its side so I can use it for these big, broad strokes. For my final take on this figure, I'm focusing on line. This can be a really challenging one to do by itself because you're robbing yourself of the framework that the earlier versions give you. So in this case, I'm just trying to create the contours of the figure, almost as if I'm drawing the negative space more than the figure itself. I really love the quality that comes from this kind of drawing that's specifically focused on line and negative space, but I will say it's one of the harder versions to adapt if you aren't particularly comfortable with anatomy. So if you find this one particularly challenging at the start, that's really normal and don't sweat it. Now I'm going to work through another pose using these same focuses, but as you'll see, I'll start out with a specific focus in mind, but I'll begin incorporating other elements as I go. So in this case, I'm starting out with the focus of expression. You might notice that even though my focus in this drawing is expression, I do make an effort to apply different amounts of pressure to my mark making tool so that certain areas appear more encased in shadow or heavier, while other areas seem brighter and lighter. Pardon my charcoal covered finger, I'm trying to refocus my camera here. Unfortunately, the beginning of this drawing was lost to that fuzzy focus, but as you can see, in this case I was focusing on form, and I've started by mapping out my figure in broad shapes, like we discussed the kind of snowman components. I try to strike a balance in my figures between addressing some of the details that people tend to want to avoid, like faces, hands, and toes, but also not letting myself get bogged down with too much detail. The general point of figure drawing is try and capture the expression and movement and anatomy of a figure, and sometimes if we spend all of our time trying to perfectly render some little toes, we get a little bit lost in the big picture. My camera once again plays me for a fool for a section of this one, but as you can see, in this approach I'm starting out with just the line. Again, like in the earlier example, I'm trying to carve out what the negative space is around the figure. Here we lose our focus for a moment. And there she is back again, and at this point I'm starting to add in more of those elements of weight and expression. For this final pass at this particular pose, I'm going to try and incorporate all of the various elements we've discussed to different degrees. Your homework assignment for the week, should you choose to accept it, is to pick at least one pose. It could be an image from Pinterest or Instagram, or if you have access to a live model, that's absolutely amazing. But I want you to try and draw the same figure at least 4 times, each one focusing on one of these aspects. If you want to get extra credit, do all 4, and then for the 5th one, try and combine all of those elements together. It's really good practice to try and draw the same pose repeatedly because it's going to show you some of the challenging areas that you maybe got lucky on once but are challenged to recreate again, and you'll be able to put them side by side to compare which aesthetics you prefer. For the rest of this video, I'm going to play the time lapse of this particular process and then the time lapse for several other figure drawings just for reference. I'm just going to let it play with music, and if you want to draw along with me, that's wonderful. If you want to watch my process, that's great too. And as always, if you have questions or comments, please let me know below. Thanks, guys!